The explosion on the 47th floor happened at exactly 1:29 p.m. Workers were fleeing in panic when 68-year-old Robert single-handedly ran into the flames. When the foreman tried to stop him, shouting, "Old man, are you going to your death?" Robert just looked over his shoulder and said, "I've died before." What happened in the next 40 minutes would be a rescue operation that even the entire fire department would admire. Because no one knew that Robert wasn't just a construction worker. No one knew that the scars on his chest and arms weren't from ordinary work accidents. And absolutely no one knew that this man had conducted the most impossible rescue operations in the world's most dangerous places for 25 years. The truth about who Robert Castellanos really was would only emerge when the smoke cleared and the doctors saw what no civilian should have survived. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from today. At 6:30 a.m. that morning, Robert Castellanos arrived at work as he always did, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel of his old blue pickup truck. He had been working on this 36-story residential project called Meridian Towers in the heart of Manhattan's financial district for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. Robert counted everything precisely, a habit from his military days that he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried to blend into civilian life. The project was one of the most ambitious construction undertakings in the city, destined to house Manhattan's elite when completed in 18 months. He parked his truck in slot number 47 in the workers' lot, the same spot every single day for over 3 years. He took his dented thermos of black coffee, no cream, no sugar, exactly the way he'd drunk it in forward operating bases from Somalia to Afghanistan. He retrieved his yellow hard hat, the same one he'd worn since his first day, now bearing the scratches and dings of countless hours under construction lights. His safety vest hung perfectly straight, each reflective strip positioned with military precision that none of his co-workers ever noticed but would have immediately recognized if they'd served. The other workers streaming through the gates knew him simply as Old Robert, the quiet guy who always arrived early, never complained, never caused trouble, and somehow managed to make even the most difficult tasks look effortless. To foreman Dave Morrison, Robert was the most reliable worker he'd ever supervised. Never late, never sick, never involved in the workplace drama that seemed to follow construction crews everywhere. What Dave didn't know was that Robert's personnel file contained references from employers who didn't technically exist, recommendations written by men whose names appeared on no official rosters, and background checks that had been conducted by agencies that operated in the shadows of government bureaucracy. Dave had hired Robert 3 years ago after a series of interviews that had felt more like briefings than job applications. Robert's previous supervisors had used phrases like exceptional under pressure, natural leadership abilities, and performs best in crisis situations, descriptions that seemed oddly specific for construction work, but had proven accurate every single day Robert showed up for duty. Because that's how Robert thought of it, even now, reporting for duty, not just going to work. That particular Tuesday morning, Robert was assigned to the 45th floor, working alongside Tommy Martinez, a 24-year-old electrician from Queens who'd been trying to crack Robert's reserved exterior for months. Tommy was good at his job, but had an endless curiosity about the older workers, especially those who seemed to carry themselves with an indefinable sense of authority that had nothing to do with their position on the crew. "Robert, you ever think about retiring?" Tommy asked as they prepared to drill anchor points for electrical conduits. "I mean, you could probably collect Social Security, maybe get a little place in Florida, play some golf, Robert adjusted his position, checked the measurements twice with the precision of someone who understood that small mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. "I tried retiring once," he said quietly. "Didn't take." Tommy laughed. "What did you do before construction? You seem like you know your way around tools, but there's something different about you. Like you're always watching everything, you know?" For just a moment, Robert's hands stilled on his drill. Tommy had noticed something that Robert had hoped 3 years of careful behavior had concealed. In his previous life, situational awareness had meant the difference between coming home alive and coming home in a flag-draped coffin. Even now, even drilling holes for electrical work 45 stories above Manhattan, Robert knew the location of every exit, every stairwell, every potential threat or advantage in his environment. "Security work," Robert answered, which wasn't technically a lie. "Government contracts, mostly." "Like a mall cop?" Tommy pressed. "Something like that." What Robert didn't say was that his security work had involved protecting assets and personnel in locations where the United States military officially didn't operate, conducting extractions in hostile territory where failure meant not just mission failure, but international incidents. He'd spent 15 years with Delta Force, then another 10 with a classified unit that existed in the gray areas between military operations and intelligence work. At exactly 1:29 p.m., while Tommy was explaining his girlfriend's complicated relationship with her sister's boyfriend's cousin, the building shook with a violence that Robert recognized immediately. Not an earthquake, too sharp, too localized. Not structural failure. Wrong sound profile. This was an explosion, significant enough to compromise structural integrity, close enough to threaten everyone on their floor and above. Robert's response was instantaneous and automatic. While Tommy and the other workers around them froze in confusion, Robert was already moving. His first action wasn't to run or take cover, but to assess. He moved to the nearest window, looked up toward the source of the explosion, calculated wind direction, structural damage, and probable casualties. The fireball erupting from the 47th floor told him everything he needed to know. Gas explosion, major structural compromise, multiple casualties likely, and time running out for anyone trapped above the blast zone. "Gas explosion, 47th floor," he announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd delivered similar assessments under mortar fire. "Maybe 48th as secondary." Tommy stared at him. "How do you know that?" But Robert was already moving toward the stairwell, not down toward safety like everyone else, but toward the emergency equipment locker. He grabbed a flashlight, checked its battery, and clipped it to his belt. From his personal tool belt, he retrieved a multi-tool that was considerably more sophisticated than anything a construction worker should need, and a small first aid kit that he'd carried to job sites for 3 years, but never explained. Dave Morrison's voice crackled over the site radio. "All personnel evacuate immediately. Emergency crews are en route. Use stairwells A and B. Avoid elevators." While workers streamed toward the exits, Robert headed in the opposite direction. Dave spotted him near the up stairwell and intercepted him with a combination of confusion and growing alarm. "Robert, what the hell are you doing? Everyone's going down!" "There are people trapped up there, Dave." Robert's voice carried a certainty that came from experience Dave couldn't fathom. "The explosion pattern suggests the 47th and maybe 48th floors. Anyone above that is cut off from primary evacuation routes." Dave grabbed Robert's arm, genuinely afraid for the older man's safety. "The fire department will handle it. They'll be here in minutes." Robert looked at Dave with eyes that seemed to see through him, past him, into calculations and possibilities that existed in a different world from construction management. Dave, in a gas explosion of this magnitude, with the structural damage I observed, anyone trapped above the blast zone has maybe 30 minutes before heat and smoke compromise their position beyond survivability. Fire department response time from the nearest station is 8 minutes, plus another 12 to 15 minutes to establish operational parameters for a high-rise rescue. That's 23 to 25 minutes before they can even begin extraction operations. Dave stared at him. No construction worker talked like that. No civilian calculated emergency response parameters with that kind of precision. "How do you know all that?" Dave asked. Robert was already heading toward the stairs. "I used to do this for a living." "Do what for a living?" "Save people." Robert began his ascent, while Dave stood frozen, trying to process what he'd just heard. The man he'd supervised for over 3 years, the quiet worker who installed electrical fixtures and moved construction materials, had just demonstrated knowledge of emergency response procedures that suggested training Dave couldn't even categorize. The stairwell filled with smoke as Robert climbed. By the 46th floor, visibility was down to maybe 10 feet. Most people would have turned back. Robert pulled a bandana from his pocket, the same one he'd carried through 3 combat deployments, soaked it from his water bottle, and tied it over his nose and mouth. The technique was something he'd learned in a chemical warfare training course 25 years earlier, but it worked just as well for construction site smoke. The 47th floor was a vision of controlled chaos. The explosion had originated from a ruptured gas line near the building's central utilities, creating a blast pattern that had blown out windows on the southeast corner and compromised the floor's structural integrity. Debris covered everything. Electrical systems sparked and failed, and the smoke was thick enough to disorient anyone without training in zero-visibility operations. Robert moved through the devastation with a systematic precision that would have impressed his old Delta Force teammates. He called out in a voice trained to carry over battlefield noise, "Anyone hear me? Call out if you can hear my voice!" A response came from the direction of the electrical workstations. "Here! Over here! Help us!" Robert followed the voice, using his flashlight to navigate through debris that would have stopped most people. He found electrician Mike Henderson trapped under a section of collapsed ceiling, conscious but unable to move his legs. A quick assessment told Robert that Mike's injuries were serious, but not immediately life-threatening, if they could get him to medical attention within the next 20 minutes. "Mike, I'm going to get you out of here," Robert said, his voice carrying the kind of calm confidence that patients needed to hear in crisis situations. "I need you to stay still while I clear this debris." Using techniques learned in combat engineering courses, Robert systematically removed the collapsed ceiling section, creating leverage points and using proper body mechanics to move weights that should have required multiple people. Within 4 minutes, he had Mike free and was assessing his injuries with hands that moved with medical precision. "Probable spinal compression, possible internal injuries, definite concussion," Robert muttered to himself, running through diagnostic procedures he'd learned as a combat medic cross-training. "Can you feel your legs, Mike?" I think so. They hurt, but I can move them a little." "Good. That's good." Robert fashioned an improvised stretcher from debris and his own safety equipment, demonstrating knowledge of emergency medical procedures that no construction worker should possess. "I'm going to carry you out of here, but I need you to stay as still as possible." The extraction from the 47th floor to safety took Robert 12 minutes. 6 minutes longer than his old Delta Force record for casualty evacuation, but he was 68 years old now and carrying a man through a structurally compromised building filled with smoke. When he emerged from the stairwell with Mike Henderson on his back, the reaction from the assembled workers and newly arrived emergency responders was something between amazement and disbelief. Fire. Captain Michael Torres was the first to reach them. "Sir, are you civilian personnel? How did you extract this man through that level of smoke and debris?" Robert carefully lowered Mike to the ground, where paramedics immediately took over his care. "There are more people up there," he said without answering Torres's question. "At least 3 more on 47, possibly others on 48 and 49. "Sir, we need to establish a perimeter and assess structural integrity before we can authorize rescue operations," Torres explained, following department protocol. Robert looked at him with the expression of someone who'd had similar conversations with bureaucrats while American soldiers died waiting for proper authorization. "Captain, with respect, those people don't have time for assessment protocols. They need extraction now." Before Torres could respond, Robert was heading back toward the building. This time, Dave Morrison and 2 other workers tried to physically restrain him. "Robert, you can't go back in there! It's suicide!" Robert looked at the men holding his arms. Good men, concerned for his safety, trying to protect him from his own apparent death wish. What they didn't understand was that Robert had spent most of his adult life walking into situations that looked like suicide to accomplish missions that others considered impossible. "Dave, I appreciate your concern, but those people are going to die if someone doesn't get them out in the next 20 minutes. Robert's voice carried a finality that made the other men release their grip. "I've done this before, more times than I can count." "Done what before?" Dave demanded. "Brought people home." Robert's second ascent was more challenging. The smoke had thickened, structural damage had worsened, and the heat was building toward levels that would soon make the upper floors uninhabitable. But Robert moved through the environment with the confidence of someone who'd operated in far worse conditions. On the 47th floor, he found painter Sarah Chen trapped in what had been a supply closet, her leg pinned under fallen equipment. Sarah was conscious and terrified, but her injuries appeared manageable if treated quickly. "Who are you?" she asked as Robert worked to free her. "You're not a fireman." "No, I'm not." Robert used his multi-tool to create leverage, applying engineering principles he'd learned in military demolitions training. "I work construction on this site." "How do you know how to do this? You move like you've done this before." Robert had freed her leg and was fashioning a splint from available materials. "I have done this before. Different circumstances. Same principles." "Are you some kind of paramedic?" "Something like that." As Robert prepared to carry Sarah to safety, she grabbed his arm and looked directly into his eyes. What she saw there, the calm competence, the absolute confidence under pressure, the way he seemed to anticipate every challenge before it occurred, told her that whatever this man's background was, it went far beyond construction work. "You're military, aren't you?" she said. Robert paused in his preparations. In 3 years of construction work, no one had asked him that direct question. "Former military, yes." "What branch?" "Army." "Special operations." "Special operations like Green Berets?" Robert looked at her for a moment, calculating how much truth he could afford to share. "Something like that." The extraction of Sarah Chen proved more complex than Mike Henderson's rescue. Her leg injury required careful handling, and the route to the stairs had been further compromised by spreading fire. Robert had to improvise an alternate path through areas of the building that most people wouldn't have known existed, using his knowledge of construction practices and building codes that came from 3 years of daily familiarity with every inch of the structure. When he emerged with Sarah, the scene outside had transformed. Fire department operations were now in full swing, with multiple engine companies, ladder trucks, and specialized rescue equipment positioning around the building. Emergency medical teams had established a triage area, and media crews were arriving to document what was shaping up to be one of the most significant construction site emergencies in Manhattan's recent history. Captain Torres intercepted Robert as he transferred Sarah to paramedic care. "Sir, I need to know who you are and what your background is. What you're doing up there. That's not civilian rescue work. That's professional-level emergency response." Robert was already preparing for his third trip into the building. "Captain, there are still people trapped. We can discuss my qualifications later." "Sir, I can't authorize civilian personnel to continue entering a structurally compromised building. Department policy requires—" Robert turned to face Torres directly. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd commanded life-and-death operations in environments where policy took a back seat to reality. "Captain, those people have maybe 15 more minutes before heat and smoke make their positions untenable. Your department protocol calls for establishing secure perimeters and assessing structural integrity before beginning rescue operations. I understand and respect those protocols, but I also understand that by the time you've completed your assessment and deployed your rescue teams, the people I'm trying to save will be dead." Torres studied Robert's face, looking for signs of the adrenaline-fueled heroics that got civilians killed in emergency situations. Instead, he saw the calm calculation of someone who'd made similar decisions many times before. "What's your background, sir?" 25 years Army. 15 with Delta Force. 10 with classified units. Combat rescue operations in Somalia, Bosnia, Afghanistan, Iraq, and places that aren't supposed to exist on maps." Torres felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. Delta Force operators were legendary even within military circles. The absolute elite of American special operations, trained to standards that made regular special forces look like weekend warriors. "Sir, if that's true, then you know the risks you're taking." "Captain, I know exactly what the risks are. I also know what happens to people who don't get extracted from situations like this." Robert checked his equipment one final time. "I'm going back up. You can arrest me when I come back down, but those people need help now." Robert's third ascent took him to areas of the building where no fire department personnel could have operated safely. The 48th floor had sustained secondary damage from the initial explosion, creating a maze of debris, compromised structural elements, and spreading fire that required navigation skills learned in urban combat environments. He found 3 people: Carpenter Jake Sullivan, who had sustained head trauma and was unconscious; his assistant Pedro Vasquez, who had broken ribs and possible internal injuries; and structural engineer Alan Foster, who was uninjured but trapped in a section of the building where conventional escape routes had been blocked by debris. The extraction of 3 people simultaneously from a compromised position 48 stories above Manhattan street level was the kind of operation that would have challenged a full rescue team with specialized equipment. Robert accomplished it using construction materials, his personal equipment, and techniques learned in military operations, where improvisation meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. He created a makeshift pulley system using electrical conduit and climbing rope from his personal kit, established anchor points that could support the weight of multiple people, and coordinated the evacuation with the precision of someone who'd conducted similar operations under enemy fire. The entire extraction took 18 minutes, longer than Robert would have preferred, but accomplished without additional injuries to any of the casualties. When Robert emerged from the building for the 3rd time, carrying Jake Sullivan while coordinating the movement of Pedro Vasquez and Alan Foster, The assembled crowd of emergency responders, construction workers, and media representatives fell silent. What they were witnessing went beyond heroism. It was a demonstration of professional competence at a level that most of them had never seen outside of military documentaries. Dr. James Mitchell, the emergency room physician who'd been dispatched with the Advanced Life Support Unit, was the first to recognize what he was seeing. Dr. Mitchell had served as a flight surgeon with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, and had worked alongside Delta Force operators on multiple deployments. He recognized the controlled calm, the systematic approach to complex problems, and the absolute confidence under pressure that marked America's most elite warriors. "You're Delta, aren't you?" Dr. Mitchell asked, as Robert helped transfer the casualties to awaiting ambulances. Robert looked at the doctor, noting the bearing that suggested military background, the way he moved around emergency equipment, the terminology he used when communicating with paramedics. "Former Delta, yes. Your military medical?" "Was. Flight surgeon, 160th SOAR. I worked with your people in Afghanistan and Iraq." Dr. Mitchell began conducting medical assessments of the rescued personnel while continuing his conversation with Robert. "What's your specialty?" "Combat rescue? Direct action." "Started as combat rescue, moved into specialized extraction operations. Hostage recovery, personnel retrieval from denied areas, that kind of work." "How long has it been since you retired?" Robert checked his watch, calculating response times and wondering if there might be additional casualties he'd missed on his 3 trips into the building. 3 years, 2 months, 14 days? Dr. Mitchell smiled at the precision of Robert's answer. "And you've been doing construction work?" "Seemed like a good way to stay busy. Use my hands, work with a team, build something instead of tearing things down for a change." But today, the old skills came back. Robert looked toward the building where fire department crews were now conducting systematic searches of the upper floors. "The old skills never really go away, Doc. They just wait until you need them." By 3:15 p.m., Fire Department operations had confirmed that Robert's 3 extraction missions had successfully rescued everyone who'd been trapped above the blast zone. The total count was impressive by any standard. 6 people pulled from a structurally compromised building by a single individual operating without specialized equipment or backup support. Captain Torres approached Robert as emergency operations began transitioning from rescue to investigation and cleanup. "Mr. Castellanos, I've been instructed to get a complete statement from you for our incident report." Robert had been dreading this moment. 3 years of carefully maintained anonymity were about to end, replaced by official reports, media attention, and questions about a background he'd hoped to keep buried. "Captain, I'd prefer to keep this simple. I saw people in danger, I helped them get out. That's really all there is to it." "Sir, what you did today saved 6 lives, but it also demonstrated capabilities that go beyond anything we'd expect from civilian construction personnel. My supervisors need to understand who you are and how you were able to accomplish what trained rescue teams would have found challenging." Dave Morrison had been listening to the conversation, pieces of a puzzle finally starting to come together in his mind. The references that were impressive but vague. The way Robert approached problems with systematic precision. The calm competence under pressure that went far beyond normal construction site experience. "Robert," Dave said quietly, "maybe it's time to tell the truth." Robert looked at his foreman. A good man who'd given him honest work and asked no uncomfortable questions for over 3 years. Dave deserved better than continued deception, and the people Robert had rescued deserved to know that their salvation hadn't been random luck. "My name is Robert Castellanos, Sergeant Major, retired, United States Army. 25 years active duty, with 15 years in Delta Force and 10 years in a classified unit that conducted specialized operations in denied areas. Captain Torres began taking notes, but Dr. Mitchell was nodding with recognition and something approaching reverence. Specialized operations, Dr. Mitchell said. Personnel recovery? Among other things, yes. Combat search and rescue, hostage recovery, extraction of high-value assets from hostile territory, that kind of work. How many successful extractions? Robert considered the question, running through mental files of operations that spanned 2.5 decades of military service. Official count is 47 successful personnel recoveries from hostile or denied areas. Unofficial count is higher, but those operations remain classified. The number hit the assembled group like a physical blow. 47 successful rescue operations meant that Robert had literally saved dozens of American lives during his military career, operating in situations where failure meant not just mission failure, but potential international incidents. And today, Captain Torres asked, today, I saw people in danger and did what I've been trained to do for most of my adult life. I brought them home. The media attention that followed Robert's rescue operations was both inevitable and overwhelming. By evening, video footage of his extractions was playing on news channels across the country. Social media exploded with speculation about the mysterious construction worker who'd single-handedly conducted rescue operations that professional emergency responders described as extraordinary and unprecedented. Robert tried to avoid the cameras, but his identity was quickly established through public records and confirmed by military personnel who recognized his name from their own service records. By the following morning, his story was front-page news. Decorated Delta Force veteran saves 6 in Manhattan construction site explosion. The attention brought both admiration and unwanted scrutiny. Veterans groups hailed him as a hero who exemplified military values in civilian life. Military historians noted that his 47 successful rescue operations during active duty represented one of the most impressive records of any special operations soldier in recent decades. But the attention also brought questions about why a Medal of Honor recipient with Robert's background had been working construction jobs and living in relative anonymity. The answers to those questions emerged slowly through interviews with military colleagues, medical records, and Robert's own reluctant admissions. Like many special operations veterans, Robert had returned from his final deployment carrying invisible wounds that proved more challenging than any physical injury. His last mission had been a hostage rescue operation in Afghanistan that went catastrophically wrong. Intelligence failures led to an ambush that killed 3 of his team members and wounded 2 others. Robert had managed to complete the extraction of the hostages, but the cost of that success haunted him in ways that years of therapy couldn't fully address. Survivor's guilt is common among special operations veterans, explained Dr. Sarah Williams, a psychologist who specialized in treating combat trauma. When you're trained to bring everyone home, losing team members feels like personal failure, even when you've done everything humanly possible. Robert had retired from active duty with full honors and a service record that most military personnel could only dream of achieving. But the transition to civilian life proved more difficult than any mission he'd accomplished in uniform. The sense of purpose that had driven him for 25 years was gone, replaced by a civilian world that seemed to move at a different pace and operate by different rules. I tried retirement, Robert admitted during a rare interview several weeks after the rescue operations. Bought a house in North Carolina, thought about maybe doing some consulting work, writing a book about military leadership. But I couldn't settle into that life. I needed to do something with my hands, something that produced tangible results. Construction work had provided that outlet. The physical demands were manageable for someone who'd maintained military fitness standards into his 60s. The teamwork aspects reminded him of military operations, but without the life and death pressure that had defined his Army career. Most importantly, construction work allowed him to build things instead of destroying them, to contribute to creation rather than elimination. For 3 years, I was just another guy on the crew, Robert continued. I showed up on time, did my job, went home to my family. It was exactly the kind of normal life I'd thought I wanted. The explosion had changed everything, not just for the people Robert rescued, but for Robert himself. The successful completion of rescue operations under pressure had reactivated skills and instincts that had been dormant but never truly gone. More importantly, it had reminded him that his military training wasn't something to be forgotten or suppressed, but rather a set of capabilities that could serve civilian purposes when applied correctly. Within weeks of the rescue operations, Robert found himself fielding calls from emergency services departments across the country. His combination of military expertise and construction site familiarity made him uniquely qualified to consult on urban rescue operations, building collapse responses, and emergency evacuation procedures. The New York Fire Department offered him a position as a specialist consultant for high-rise emergency operations. FEMA requested his input on disaster response protocols. Military training centers asked him to develop curricula for urban combat rescue operations. Robert accepted the FEMA consulting position and several military training contracts, but he also negotiated an arrangement with Dave Morrison's construction company that allowed him to continue working on active construction sites. The combination gave him the sense of purpose he needed while allowing him to contribute to both civilian and military communities. The skills I learned in the Army don't have an expiration date, Robert explained during a training seminar for emergency responders 6 months after the Manhattan rescue operations. The environments change, the equipment changes, but the fundamentals of getting people out of dangerous situations safely remain constant. His new role as a bridge between military expertise and civilian emergency response proved both challenging and rewarding. Robert developed training programs that taught civilian first responders techniques originally designed for combat rescue operations. He consulted on building designs that incorporated lessons learned from military operations in urban environments. Most importantly, he helped other military veterans find ways to apply their specialized skills in civilian careers. Robert Castellanos represents the best of what military veterans can contribute to civilian society, said General Patricia Hayes, commanding officer of the Army's Special Operations Command. His actions in Manhattan demonstrated that the warrior ethos doesn't end when someone takes off the uniform. It transforms into a civilian commitment to service that benefits entire communities. The transformation wasn't complete without personal costs. The media attention and public recognition that followed the rescue operations forced Robert to confront aspects of his military career that he'd preferred to keep private. Family members learned details about his deployments that he'd never shared. Colleagues discovered that the quiet construction worker they'd known was actually one of America's most decorated special operations veterans. Most challenging was the renewed contact with surviving members of his old military units. Phone calls from former teammates, letters from families of soldiers he'd served with, invitations to reunion events that he'd avoided for 3 years. The Brotherhood of Special Operations Forces didn't recognize retirement as an end to relationships forged in combat, and Robert's public emergence brought him back into a community he'd thought he'd left behind. "The hardest part wasn't the rescue operations," Robert admitted during a quiet moment several months later. "The hardest part was accepting that I couldn't hide from who I used to be. The Army made me who I am, and trying to pretend that 25 years of service didn't matter was doing a disservice to everyone I served with." A year after the Manhattan rescue operations, Robert had found a balance between his military past and civilian present. He continued working construction projects, but now as a safety consultant who specialized in emergency response planning. He taught rescue techniques to both military and civilian personnel. Most importantly, he'd become a mentor to other veterans who were struggling with the transition from military to civilian life. "Service doesn't end when you take off the uniform," became Robert's standard advice to retiring military personnel. "It just changes form. The question isn't whether you'll continue to serve, but how you'll choose to serve." The construction site where Robert's rescue operations took place was completed 18 months later. The building was renamed Castellanos Tower in honor of the man who'd saved 6 lives during its construction, though Robert had requested that no such recognition be given. A memorial plaque in the lobby commemorates the rescue operations and honors the principle that heroism often comes from ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. Robert continues to live in Manhattan, working on construction projects and consulting on emergency response operations. He's married to Maria, his wife of 32 years, and they have 2 adult children who are immensely proud of their father's service, but also grateful that he's found a way to contribute to society without putting his life at constant risk. When asked about his legacy, Robert typically deflects the question. "I'm not a hero," he insists. "I'm just a guy who had some training that turned out to be useful when people needed help. Any of my old teammates would have done the same thing." But those who know Robert's full story understand that his impact goes beyond the 6 people he pulled from a burning building. His example has inspired other veterans to find ways to continue serving in civilian life. His training programs have improved emergency response capabilities for first responders across the country. Most importantly, his willingness to act when action was needed has reminded everyone that heroism isn't about rank, medals, or recognition. It's about the willingness to help others when help is needed, regardless of personal risk or cost. Robert Castellanos' story shows us that real heroism isn't about rank, medals, or recognition. It's about serving quietly, risking your life when necessary, and never giving up. Have you ever met such a hero? Share in the comments, and remember, sometimes the ordinary person sitting next to you might actually have an extraordinary past.